Hello and welcome everybody to our third IJNA webinar, Sewn Sailing Hypotheses. Normally I start with a bit of an introduction, but I'm going to go straight into our panel today. To kick off, we're going to have Dr. Lucy Blue. Lucy is a NAS Vice President and IJNA Advisory Editor, Honor Frost Foundation Archaeological Director, and a lecturer in the Centre for Maritime Archaeology at Southampton University. She was also one of the co-organisers of the fibre and wood sewn boat construction techniques through time workshop that was held in Oman in 2015, I think, which has the presentations from which have formed a special section in the latest edition of the IJNA. So her co-organizer with that was Dr. Eric Staples. He's assistant professor at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, and his research revolves around maritime history of the Indian Ocean and littoral societies, with a particular focus on shipbuilding, seafaring and navigation. And he's been involved in a large number of the fantastic reconstruction projects that have taken place in Oman, and he's going to tell us about some of those more later. Another of his colleagues is up next, Alessandro Guidoni, who's currently a doctoral student at Exeter. Hi, Alessandro.
Hi.
At Exeter University, researching the sewn plank ship timbers from the Islamic site of Al Badid. But he's been involved in the reconstruction projects in Oman for a very long time as well. And then finally, moving away from Oman, we're going to come back to the Mediterranean with Professor Patrice Paumet, who's Emeritus Director of Research at the CNRS and the Centre Camille Julien at Aix-Marseille University. Patrice has studied ship and boat structure throughout a long and prolific career that started, well, at least the underwater part started in the 1970s. I'm not sure where he started digging, on the Planier 2 and Madrague de Gien wrecks. Ship structures and ship construction has been a major part of his work, and we're absolutely delighted to have him with us.
Thank you very much for giving us all the opportunity for talking around this special edition of papers published in the IJNA, and thank you for agreeing to publishing them as well. My paper is going to reflect a little bit of the work that Eric and I published in the latest journal, but also work as an introduction to not just this webinar, but also the context of the papers that were published in IJNA, but also the topic of sewn boats in particular, sewn boats leading through to reconstruction. I have to admit that reconstruction is less of my expertise, but sewn boats I know a little bit about. And I guess we started by thinking about this quote from Prins, who published in 1986 the Handbook of Sewn Boats, and he said the technique of sewing planks was past tense, so widespread it was universal. And so we started questioning this, Eric and I, and thinking about how we might pursue an understanding of that in the 20th century, because previous work had been conducted in the mid-1980s, including the publication by Prins, which was extremely comprehensive, not just in overviewing the evidence for sewn boats, not only currently, but also archaeological evidence, and I will review some of the other types of evidence in a minute, but also in looking at the specific nature of sewing, because obviously what we're really talking about is boats made of wood that are sewn together with different types of fibre, depending on where and when, generally as a continuous stitching process or sewing process. So it's a continuous sewing process, not always, as we'll see. So this is the construction technique that we're addressing in this discussion. But the first thing we did was to review the data, and Prins was the primary one, and followed very closely by McGrail and Kentley's 1985 publication that basically brought a group of scholars together in Greenwich the year before, in 1984, including Patrice and some others who we invited to our workshop in Oman in 2015, basically to review the current state of evidence. The reach of the first conference was much broader. It covered all geographical scope, and I'll go back to that in a minute. But we decided we'd focus primarily on the Indian Ocean because that was our focus of expertise, and that's what's reflected in this webinar today, but also trying to compare that with some of the excellent material that was coming out, largely driven through Aix-Provence and Patrice's work in the Mediterranean, looking at the first millennium analogue of sewn boats and how we could compare the processes of sewing. And that actually led to a very stimulating discussion. We had about 15 presenters and a day of practical getting out there and actually sewing timbers together, which was much fun because we compared the different techniques in the Indian Ocean and in the Mediterranean. So my job was primarily to address and do an overview of the evidence. Obviously supported with Eric because Eric's an historian, he has a much more in-depth historical understanding of the evidence we have for sewn boats, specifically in the Indian Ocean. But we reviewed that evidence. We thought about, the archaeological evidence. We questioned Prince, is it so widespread that it's universal, this evidence? And what we began to find out is actually the evidence archaeologically, historically, ethnographically is perhaps not so in depth, and so we wanted to explore how we might update our knowledge and also improve our understanding of sewn boats in this decade. So what I'm going to do is briefly outline some of the types of evidence and also think about the sort of chronological depth to that evidence and the geographical spread or scope of that evidence. But as I've said, the purpose of our meeting in 2015 and of the large majority of papers published in the IJNA was around the Indian Ocean, with the exception, obviously, of Patrice's excellent work. So what is the evidence for sewn boats in a very broad brush? We have extensive textual evidence, but they come in many forms and they come across a very long range of time. Probably the one that I'm most familiar with is the Periplus, that was a document written in the 1st century AD that mentions these strangely constructed vessels. And this idea of things being constructed in a slightly bizarre way is definitely a narrative that continues through the evidence of the Arabian travellers, and most definitely when you come to the European accounts of sewn boats, because they were unfamiliar. They weren't necessarily things that they were used to seeing, certainly in the context of 18th, 19th century explorers around the waters of Northwest Europe. So the textual evidence we have, but it's usually it's disparate in time, and it's not always so detailed, but it gives us an insight. Obviously, the iconography is a type of evidence that archaeologists use regularly. As we know, iconography is not necessarily three-dimensional, in fact, very rarely. It's not necessarily that detailed. It's constrained by the nature of the material in which the objects have been drawn or photographed or inscribed. But the bottom left-hand image is a wonderful one that was from the 17th century by Bowery of a sewn boat from India, which gives you some insight not only into the construction techniques but of the time depth of how long these boats have been around. So the evidence that I feel much more comfortable with is the archaeological evidence. But again, the archaeological evidence is patchy. I'll draw your attention to this slide in the top right-hand part of this image, which is actually some timbers that I discovered in a site on the Red Sea coast of Egypt at Qasr al-Qadim that were reused sewn boat timbers in a burial context from around the 12th to 15th century. But as my fellow presenters will tell you, the evidence is more extensive in the Indian Ocean, but it's still quite patchy. Ali knows that very well because he's been studying that in a lot of depth through his PhD. So the archaeological evidence, and then of course the ethnographic evidence, and that's something that I've also spent quite a lot of time pursuing, not just in the current context of trying to identify and record in as much detail as possible the current evidence for sewn boat construction and use, but also reflecting back on proto-ethnography ethnographic accounts. So thinking about people such as Hornell and Solvins, and who discussed and described and sometimes drew boats in the past, or photographs. So we have a wealth of evidence here, but it's again quite sporadic and not always as detailed as we'd like. But this is the sort of evidence that we're drawing on, and obviously that leads through then to collating and combining this evidence into thinking about how we might go about reconstruction, which I will hand over to my colleagues too. So this is obviously the example of the Jewel of Muscat, and one that I'm a little bit more familiar with, a vessel based on a hypothetical reconstruction of a collection, I guess, of boats from Europe and England in particular in the Bronze Age. This is Morgawa, the boat that we reconstructed with the University of Exeter in the Falmouth Maritime Museum, and this is her first day of going to the water. So I have a little bit of experience of reconstruction, but not regrettably in the Indian Ocean. So thinking about breadth, this is an image that I sort of basically appropriated, should I say, from Prinz. And you can see that the geographical spread of or breadth of sewn boats is actually quite widespread, as he noted. I'm sorry, Patrice, I haven't filled in the first millennium BC Mediterranean boats here, which is an oversight. But we can see that boats are coming from Northwest Europe, from the UK, from the Polynesian islands, through to the coasts of America, various parts of Africa, most definitely, and some of the earliest evidence coming from the Mediterranean region, not just the material that Patrice and other colleagues have identified and excavated from the first millennium BC, but some of the earliest evidence comes from Egypt, for example, in the form of the Cheops boat from around 2600 BC. And then a lot of material coming from, or more material anyway, coming from the Indian Ocean, but moving now into the sort of later part of the first millennium AD. So we've got quite a broad geographical spread and chronological depth. But the focus of most of the discussion for this webinar and for the IJNA series and for our conference in 2015 was the Indian Ocean. And I'm just going to, this is my final slide, but just to focus in a little bit, showing you examples of archaeology, of iconography, of boats literally from around the shores of the Indian Ocean, from Lake Victoria, bottom left, through to the Mtepe, which is this mythical now boat that was described, and perhaps some timbers have been found in Mombasa in Kenya that was no longer represented and was never recorded even ethnographically, the Mtepe, but a sewn boat. My timbers from Corsair, material that still exists around the shores of the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, that Eric will speak about, and a lot of work that has been done by, this is Eric Kentley actually, recording some of the Masula boats in India, and there are other varieties of sewn boats still built and used in India, through to the more diverse in construction, initially doweled and sewn, and then with these lash lug techniques that Pierre Mangouin describes in the collection of articles in IJNA. So we've got, this demonstrates the breadth and of different approaches to sewing, and also this large sort of geographical spread. I think I've probably spoken more than my time, so I shall finish there and hand over to my colleague. I think Eric's next, if I'm correct, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. That was great. That was a really good introduction to this unusual, well, less unusual than you might think, type of boat construction. We're going to move over to Eric Staples now, who's going to talk to us about some of the reconstruction projects that have taken place in Oman. I'm sure Eric would want me to underline that these projects have been conducted by a huge team of people, including Tom Vosmer and Nick Birmingham, as well as Alessandro, and a whole team of boat builders, some of whom were brought over from India to help, and local boat builders as well. So Eric, over to you.
Thank you very much, Miranda, for inviting me to be part of the webinar, and also the organizers. And also thanks a lot to, as you mentioned, the incredibly large team that basically built all of these reconstructions, including Alessandro and Tom Vosmer. I'm merely the talking head in some ways at the moment. But the idea with this is to do sort of a very brief summary of the article that's on the same topic in the IJNA, which is to examine the 3 sewn boat reconstructions that the government of Oman has undertaken in the last 40 years of medieval sewn plank vessels, and to look at them in an explicitly comparative context, the particular focus on documentation. These vessels are the Sohar, which you can see on the lower left, Jewel of Muscat, which is the upper photo, and then the Hariri Boat, which is in the lower right. And I'll talk about each one individually and then briefly sort of compare data involved with documenting the process of sewing them. Now, Sohar, I wasn't involved in the Sohar project, but it definitely deserves to be mentioned because it was the first sewn boat reconstruction in Oman, undertaken under the direction of Tim Severin and the Ministry of Culture and Heritage in Oman in 1980 and 81. And it was really sort of what you would call a pioneering project to build a hypothetical reconstruction of a medieval sewn vessel and then to sail it to China, proving that basically such a sewn boat could in fact make the voyage. Now, lacking any meaningful archaeological evidence at the time, such as Lucy mentioned, the design was largely based on a modern Arab double-ended dhow type called a boom, which was actually nailed in the 20th century, but resembled some iconography from sort of the 13th and 16th centuries, and then was sewn by a team of Southern Indian and Lakshadweep Island rope workers and shipwrights, basically. It's thus we would consider it sort of an iconographic / ethnographic reconstruction due to the absence of any of what you would call meaningful archaeological evidence at the time. With the Jewel of Muscat, that shifts. It was basically a joint Omani-Singapore government initiative to build an archaeological reconstruction of a specific 9th century ship that sank off Belitung Island in Indonesia. The wreck itself was salvaged by a salvaging company, Seabed Explorations, in 1998 to 2000. And the details of the remains of the hull itself, which were rather interesting, were published by Michael Flecker and IJNA in 2001. The stitching of this vessel was remarkably different from most stitching in the sense that it had wadding. You can see sort of this fibrous material running along the seams on both the inside and the outside of the vessels, what we refer to as the double wadding method. The construction, which was based on the archaeological evidence, as well as combining some of the secondary iconographic evidence, took about a year and then a little over 4 months for fitting out and sea trials. And then we sailed the vessel from Muscat to Singapore over a little over 4.5 month voyage, stopping in India, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia along the way. And the third one was also another interesting one. This was a Museum of History of Islamic Science at the German University of Technology. Basically asked a core of us from the Jewel of Muscat group to build an explicitly what they refer to as an iconographic reconstruction of the vessel depicted in sort of the upper right. This is a manuscript copy of the Maqamat al-Hariri, sort of a series of Arab tales that has this wonderful illustration of a merchant vessel from the 13th century. Now, the reconstruction that we built was 13 meters long at sort of a 3/4 scale, largely because of the limitations of the exhibition space where it was going to be shown. And the stitching technique, which you can see here most likely, is the single wadding, where on the inside you have the wadding running along the seams, and on the outside you have this double, what we call these vertical stitches. And this was largely due to the sort of the stitching represented in the drawing, as well as some albalid timbers also from the 13th century. Now, what I would sort of likely, I guess, sort of want to talk about briefly is comparing the data derived from the documentation, because I think documentation is perhaps one of the most important parts of these experimental reconstruction processes that sort of, I would say, determines the academic worth and integrity of the project, at least in the long term. Now, Severin provided an excellent description of the sewing process for Sohar in his article in the Sewn Boats proceedings in 1985, as well as his sort of popular narrative called the Sinbad Voyage. But with the Jewel of Muscat and the Hariri Boat, the idea was to further expand or go into more depth and technical detail and to document the entire process. For the Jewel of Muscat, we were actually tasked to document every single stitch, which was, the boat had around over 37,000 holes, 33,000 planking holes. So there was over 130,000 stitches, which was a rather substantial challenge, let's put it that way. So we came up with this methodology of creating a stitching history, which is basically just a drawing of the plank. You can see in the lower part of the screen, that then records basically every single stitch, who made it, from what hole to when, over the time period, the date, any particular features, broken rope, etc. So basically at the end of this, which we also applied to the Hariri Boat construction, we had sort of this incredible amount of data, in which we could basically compare with one another to sort of understand the differences between these two very different methods. What was immediately apparent was that the single wadding was definitely quicker, but we could sort of quantify in many ways how much quicker, and much of it depended on the context of where the plank was, whether it was in the bow or the stern, or the experience of the rope workers, etc. And collectively, this sort of documentation of, I guess we would call the actual entire process of stitching, gives us a sort of other layer of information to sort of, what I would say, complement the very sparse textual and archaeological evidence, particularly for the medieval period. And I think I'll end there. Thank you very much. Pass it over to Alessandro.
Thank you very much, Eric. That was very, very interesting. It's really good to see the stitching recording sheets and the detail that you went into in recording this project. So Alessandro is going to talk to us about the Beyden Seyad project, which is a replica of a 19th century sewn fishing vessel that's also from Oman. So yes. Alessandro, we're over to you.
Hello everyone, and thanks Miranda and Mark for inviting me to this webinar, for this opportunity. So I'm going to talk about the project, this reconstruction project, which was undertook just after the Jewel of Muscat project. So the Baden is a fishing boat that was used in Oman in the 19th century. It was documented by Admiral Pâris in 1838, 1839, when he visited Oman. And the particularity of the boat is that it's a completely sewn boat, and it has no frames, which is very unusual. So Pâris documented the boat and provided quite detailed technical drawings, which we used in 2012 to build a slightly smaller scale replica of the vessel for the National Museum of Oman. The team comprised myself, Eric Staples, Tom Bosmer, and very, very important rope workers and shipbuilders from southern India, from Kerala, and also Omani trainees. The project aimed basically to experiment with sewn plank construction, and especially with the single wadding method, which was different from the one used in the Jewel of Muscat. And basically just to deepen our knowledge about various aspects about sewn plank construction, and to have a glimpse basically of what is behind the building of a sewn boat. So first of all, I would like to talk about the construction method, which also was interesting during the building of the boat. These boats are built shell first, and since this boat doesn't have any shell first method, sorry, I will explain very briefly. It's basically a construction method that just consists of building the hull of the boat, assembling the hull of the boat before the fitting of the frames. In this particular case, there are no frames at all, so it's quite interesting, which basically forced us to find different solutions and to the technical issues during the construction. One was the use of temporary buttons, temporary frames, and dowels, because we realized that it was basically impossible to hold all these construction elements together before the sewing. Also, we realized there's planks have to be pre-shaped, so we used fire. We used it basically to shape, to bend them and twist them with fire, because since there are no frames around which to force bend the planking, you basically have to shaped them before. Also, quite interesting was studying and seeing actual boat builders using traditional tools, and also it forced us to find, as I said before, solution in boat building. For example, the first stage of the construction, we built the boat upside down, which facilitated the assemblage of the keels and the keel plank and the garboards. Another important aspect of this project was the material, was about the materials. In Pâris drawings and Pâris description in the essay, we have no information about the material used for building this boat. So we have to turn to other sets of evidence, which, for example, ethnographic and ethnographic records and historical sources. So we use teak for the planking for almost every wooden parts of the boat, which also we learn about the advantages of the materials, but also all the issues involved with the use of teak, for example, which we realized it probably wasn't ideal for this particular kind of boats because of the wide planks and very long, which is difficult to find for teak. Also, coir was used as a fiber to make the rope for the cordages that we used to sew the hull. I mean, coir is universally mentioned in historical sources from the medieval period through the Portuguese sources, and even in more recent recent periods. And it's an amazing material. We realize how important is the coconut products in the building, in the construction of sewn boats. It's a crucial element. And also we realize that since teak is from India, coir is from India, laccatives, we realize how much there is in this boat from this particular country, from India, from the other side of the Western Indian Ocean. Another, obviously, very important aspect was the sewing technique. Again, it was a great opportunity, first of all, to experiment with the single wadding method, which consists of, Eric explained it before, for the sohar. And also, it was great to see actual sewn rope workers and boat builders experienced with sewn plank construction, seeing them in action, learn from them, and see what were the issues and all the advantages of this method. Again, quite curious was also to see how different parts of the boat are sewn in a different way, or lashed or fastened in a different way. So there's a variety also of fastening technique, and also we realized that there were a few parts of the boat which were really difficult and challenging to do. Again, one of the most important aspects, probably the most important aspect of this project, is the documentation. So we recorded every aspect of the construction with photos and videos, with the aim of creating an archive. Every part of the boat was measured, and we created technical drawings like the one you see now. And so basically, we created also documentation forms, like specific forms to document every process and every elements of the construction, which also led us to create kind of criteria, guidelines for future projects. It can also be revised for other sewn boats. So to conclude, it was a great project which involved, especially because it involved skilled rope workers. Unfortunately, we didn't do any sea trials, so there is that aspect lacking from this project. So we didn't have the chance to test the performances of the boat. But nevertheless, this project generated plenty of information and data, and also stimulated, in various occasions, the multidisciplinary approach, which included all the relevant evidence from the archaeological evidence, ethnographic, historical sources. And one last aspect before I conclude is that this technique is rapidly disappearing in the Western Indian Ocean, almost worldwide actually. And so hence the project is very important because also this kind of project also help to preserve this particular knowledge of sewn boats. I will pass it to Patrice now.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. That was great. So yes, now we're going to move away from Oman and the Indian Ocean and to the Mediterranean, where Patrice Paume is going to talk to us about the Gyptis, the sailing replica of a 6th century BC archaic Greek sewn boat. He's published 2 papers recently in the IJNA alongside Pierre Poveda, who also worked on the Gyptis project. I wanted to point out as well that alongside Giulio Boeto, in the previous edition of the IJNA, he published a large article which looked at the 63, I think, archaeologically recorded sewn boats in the Mediterranean region and tried to classify them into different traditions. So I would encourage you to look at that article as well. Patrice, over to you.
Thank you very much, Miranda, and good evening, everyone. I want to present you the Gyptis, with a sailing replica of a Greek archaic sewn boat resulting from the wreck Jules-Verne 9. The origin of the project dates back to 1993, with the discovery in the ancient port of Marseille of 2 archaic Greek shipwrecks from the second half of the 6th century BC. One of them, the Jules-Verne 9 wreck, preserved for 5 meters in length, corresponds to a fully sewn boat whose elements are assembled either by sewing for the planking or by lashings for the framing. In several places, remains of the sewings and lashings have been kept in place thanks to the protective coating of the hull. After the archaeological study, the reconstruction of the original boat was undertaken. First, special attention was paid to the assembly system, a theoretical diagram of which was carried out, as well as a study model, scale 1, corresponding to a portion of the hull of about 1 meter square. Then, the overall reconstruction of the boat, shape and structure, was carried out from archaeological data of the wreck and comparative data from other wrecks of the same type and same period, and also from iconographical data. The reconstruction was carried out from drawings, study and control models, scale 1/10, and then 3D computer models. The result corresponds to a large coastal rowing and sailing boat of about 10 meters long and just under 2 meters wide, used for fishing and local transport. After several years of preparation, the construction of the sailing replica of Jules-Verne 9, named Gyptis, after the name of the local princess who married Protis, the leader of the Greek settlers who founded Marseille, began in 2013. That is exactly 20 years after the wreck was discovered. The hull was built according to the shell-first method. The main phases were the laying of the keel and of the 3 first strakes, the fitting of the floor timbers and the end of the planking, the setting up of the futtocks, top timbers and beams, and finally, the installation of the masthead timber with the mast box and of the little fore and aft decks. Once the hull finished, a protection coating made of a mix of resinous pitch and beeswax was put inside and outside. Then the boat was rigged and equipped. All the elements of the hull are assembled by sewing and lashings. The assembly of the planking is very sophisticated and use oblique channels that end into tetrahedral recesses. The sewing are composed of 3 threads of linen passed in a cross pattern with a tightening tour and an oblique passage go and back. Beforehand, a wadding made of linen fabric is placed on the plank joint, and small pegs blocks the threads. Carpenter marks ensure the regularity of the wool. The sewings do not come out and are not visible on the outside of the hull. The frames are assembled by external lashings. The internal coating, made of resin and beeswax, protects all the ligatures. After the launch of the boat, we carried out trial sailings in order to learn how to handle the boat and to evaluate its nautical capabilities under oars, under sail and oars, and under sail. The boat is fast and sensitive, and the best performance are achieved broad reach with a maximum speed of about 6-7 knots. Particular attention has been paid to the behavior of ligatures. They have proven to be very effective and stronger than expected. The same goes for the protective coating that plays its role very well. So after 6 years of navigation, very few ligatures have to be repaired, and the boat is still in a very good state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrice. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
So we've looked at reconstructions based on archaeological finds. We've looked at one based on an ethnographic record and one based on mainly iconographic data, which I think shows the the very wide potential there is for these sorts of projects. We're going to move now on to your questions. So I'm going to start. We've got quite a few questions coming from the audience. You can carry on typing them in if you want to. I'm going to start with one by Aya Omar, that's coming from Aya Omar, who says, so was the first appearance of sewn sailing vessels in the Middle East? And I'm going to add to that a second part, which is and are sewn boats still being used in the Indian Ocean and elsewhere? Are there still sewn boats being used in the Mediterranean or other parts of the world? Perhaps we'll start with Alessandro.
Well, we have textual sources mentioning sewn boats in the Indian Ocean in the 1st century. For example, the Periplus was mentioned sewn boats in the in this region. We also have archaeological evidence, very early archaeological evidence of sewn boats probably lashed with ropes in the Gulf and in Oman. And obviously we have the most spectacular evidence of Egyptian sewn boats, which have a completely very peculiar sewing technique. So
are the Egyptian ones the earliest ones we know of?
Yes, I would say yeah. They are the earliest, absolutely. They still use them, for example, in southern India or southwest India, West India, Goa. Only in in rivers and lakes in the backwaters, and they still use them for transporting goods, but also for tourism purpose. They have like beautiful, what they call it, houseboats, and they still repair them. But there's otherwise, I can't think of other places along the Western Indian Ocean where, in Oman, they're not using them anymore, and probably the last one was from 70s, 80s.
I'm going to point out that there's 2 other articles in the section that we published in the IJNA about some of the sewn boats in Goa.
So they're discussing the boats from Goa, as you say, and I mean they are still being built and used, but certainly if we think about the Masula boats, which Eric Kentley recorded and I studied a little bit, you know, as Ale mentioned in his presentation, you know, the evidence for traditionally built boats, let alone sewn boats, is dying at a rapid pace. So, but India is one of the few places where they are still in small quantities being built and used. And I would refer people to the papers in the IJNA that you've just mentioned.
And Patrice, what's the earliest evidence for sewn boats in the Mediterranean area?
Yes, the oldest evidence are literary evidence from the Homeric period. In the Iliad and in the Odyssey, Homer is speaking about sewn boat. But the oldest archaeological evidence is provided by the Zambratija shipwrecks found recently in Croatia and studied by Julia Boeto. And it's end of a Bronze Age boat of about 10th century, 11th centuries BC. This is the oldest archaeological evidence. And then we have a lot of evidence for the Greek archaic period, 6th century BC, which is maybe the richest period for the sewn boat.
And do we think that they would have been using sewn boats in the Indian Ocean at similar periods, and it's just that we haven't found them?
I'm just thinking of the reconstructions material as well, which Alan mentioned in passing. So we have insight, should we say, into the fact that they are stitching or lashing or sewing something, you know, wooden planks from the second millennium BC. Is that right, Subject? Ale, Eric.
Yeah.
So I mean, okay, the evidence is limited, but
third millennium.
Russell Gies, you mean? You
said
Russell, yeah, it's third millennium.
Yes, I have a precision more about the Mediterranean. I want to say that in the Mediterranean today, we don't use sewn boat, and the sewing technique disappear mainly during the Hellenistic, classical and Hellenistic period, but with some very little place where the use of sewing technique were used until the medieval ages. But nowadays, no, we don't have any evidence for sewing technique.
Okay, I'm very pleased to see we've got a question from Abhirada Kamut, who for Ali. Abhirada is actually investigating a recent discovery of a sewn boat in Thailand, which has got all of us extraordinarily excited. So she wants to know, Ali, where are the boat building crews from, especially the sewing crews? We could ask Eric the same, because I think the crews were used on both projects. Were they local people, or where did they come from?
Okay, hi Pook. Yeah, so the team, the rope workers team was mainly from Kannur, from Calicut, near Calicut, and some were from Cochin, and a few were from Trivandrum, so they're all basically Kerala. And we also have Omani, a group of Omani trainees, which work with the Indian specialists and learn the technique. So they're also capable of sewing a boat now.
I think in many ways that was largely because sort of the remaining, I guess we would call, community of boat builders that still sewn boats is from Kerala. And so in order to gain from their expertise, there's very few communities that still actually know how to sew a boat, or at least with the skills that the Carolans and the Lakshadweep Islanders. And I think that's also one of the challenges of doing these experimental reconstructions, is that in many ways it's influenced largely by sort of these ethnographic choices of choosing Southern Indian rope workers. But whilst trying to still sort of experiment with evidence from what appear to be other parts of the Indian Ocean. And so trying to accurately reflect stitching traditions that aren't necessarily from Kerala, while still having basically Carolan rope workers do the actual stitching. I find that always a very interesting challenge. Let's put it that way.
Do we have any idea of the size limitations for building sewn boats? I mean, some of the reconstructions we've looked at were relatively small, 10 meters or so, but Jewel of Muscat was what was the length of the Jewel in the end, Eric?
18.6 meters in length, but Sohar was actually considerably, it was 87 feet overall in length. So I would say at the moment, Sohar has been the biggest reconstruction. And the Phantom Serum wreck looks to be incredibly large, I know as well, seems to suggest. What the actual largest vessel, sewn vessel that's been documented, I would say on the sort of upper end of 26 to 30 meters, I would say. Are you aware of anything else?
Capable of sea voyaging.
Yes, definitely. But even the Jewel of Muscat, which was 18.6 meters, still sailed remarkably well across the Indian Ocean. And you have even smaller vessels that could make it.
And so we've got another question, which is, do we have an idea of the life expectancy of a sewn boat? I know, Patrice, when you and Pierre started the project, you were expecting to have to do quite a lot of repairs on the ligatures, and in fact, Gyptis so far has stayed in very good condition. Although I know you take very good care of her. So, do we have
Yes.
do we have any notion at all of how long, and how can we find it? I suppose in archaeological evidence we might have evidence for repairs, but does anyone have any ideas on that?
Yes, it was a very good surprise. And at the early beginning of the project, I thought the boat will sail for 1 to 2 years. And after, I think that we will have to do a lot of repair. But in fact, we have just changed very little sewing and a little more lashing, because the bottom of the frames are always in wet condition. So we have to repair the lashing of the floor timbers more often than the stitching of the planking. But another reason was, of course, the quality of the construction. And I say thank you to the shipwright who do it. And also, the coating was very effective, and we change the coating every year. We change it outside and inside, and we put a new coating. But the mix of resin, pitch resin, and beeswax is very, very effective. And so it's a very good protection for the stitching. And then I must to say that we sail, but we don't sail like in antiquity, that is to say every day. We sail only sometimes, more or less frequently, but we don't use the boat every day for working, sailing in Ross Sea, and so on. So we have a use of the boat very careful, and so that maybe explain also the longevity of the sewing. But it is really a very good surprise, and we don't have opening of the seams, and the wood is the planking is very watertight, and that's really a very, very good surprise.
Yeah, there are like some historical sources saying that if it's well maintained, it can last up to 100 years. But usually you have to. Yes, I think it's about the metepe. But at the same time, what they say is that you have to replace the sewing quite regularly, from a few months period to like a year, every couple of years. So there is a lot of maintenance, as Patrice was saying. And when you build this boat, you realize, I mean, that the Baden, for example, was centerpiece for a museum, so the maintenance was a big challenge and also the biggest nightmare. So you have to put oil and keep the ropes the cordage oiled and moistened, just to avoid to get them dried. And so this is a lot of work. You just realize when you start making these vessels, basically.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions that have come in from Douglas Inglis and also from Norbert Weissman, who's another IJNA author in the special section, about the flexibility. We published one of the articles by Nick Birmingham, which suggested that the sewn hulls are not inherently more flexible, which had been said by previous authors, but it comes more from the lightness of the plank or thinness of the planking and the lightness of the construction, rather than the fact that it's rope that's been used of different sorts to fasten the boat together. So I've got two questions. One is, those of you that sailed in sewn boats, do you have any comments to make? How did you feel about the flexibility of those vessels? And secondly, how can we quantify flexibility in sewn vessels so we can compare? Eric, should we start with you?
Sure. I was actually remarkably impressed by how strong the Jewel of Muscat was during the voyage across the Indian Ocean. The hull seemed a lot more rigid than I had anticipated. I think in many ways Nick is right, particularly because it was rather heavily framed for a sewn boat, and the frames were rather substantial. So I was sort of expecting it to be much more flexible than it actually was. The question of how you actually test flexibility is a little more difficult. We'd actually tried to put up, I guess you would call laser measuring devices to measure the degree in which the hull would change, particularly when we were sailing in rough seas across the Bay of Bengal. And we're never really able to successfully measure that. There was also some hull distortion, which we did notice when we took out of the water in India. There was 1 to 2 centimeters of spacing between the futtocks and the floor timbers in some spaces. But overall, I mean, having read the historical accounts of it, I had expected it to be an incredibly flimsy vessel, and was actually surprised at how rigid it was.
Patrice, did you want to say something about the
Yes.
flexibility of Gyptis?
Yes, it's a very interesting question, but it's not only the problem of the sewing. I think it's we have two parameters, and another problem is the system of construction. And I think the shell-first construction is also a way to flexibility. So the problem of the sewn boat is that they are mainly shell-first built, and so it's difficult to understand what is a part of the system of construction, the flexibility of the shell-first methods, and the flexibility of the sewn technique of assembly. So the problem is we lack of comparison. I don't know how to do. The problem from the mechanical problem is very difficult to understand and to quantify in order to have a comparison possible. So it's really a problem. But I think with modeling, we can maybe reproduce the rigidity of the hull, and to maybe have some idea of this flexibility. It's really a very good, interesting question.
Yes, I think it's one to work on. I was just wondering if some of the reconstructions that are now in museum situations, if there's some way we could try and bend them a bit and see what happens. Would that be allowed? Probably not. Okay, I'm slightly overwhelmed by the quality of our attendees at this seminar, but we have a question from Tom Rosmer, who we could have invited to talk, but he sent a question in anyway. What are the This is for Patrice. What are the displacement and sail area of Gyptis?
The displacement is about 3 tons, and the sail area is 25 meters square. But with a system of rails, which is quite characteristic of the ancient Mediterranean sail.
And I've got a comment in from Valerie Fenwick, who's another of the authors from the special section, who says that in Goa, sewn boats can last several generations, going back to our previous question. There's quite a few very precise questions about particular ones, but I'm going to go for the waterproofing. Are sewn boats waterproof? How much water seeps through, and what techniques do they use to keep them watertight? Eric, maybe?
Okay. The simple answer is I don't think I've ever been on a wooden boat that's ever been completely watertight, nailed or sewn. What was particularly interesting about the Jewel was when we put her in the water, she flooded rather quickly. But we let her sit for about 2 or 3 days and then pump the water out, and she was much more watertight. Now, that being said, we did have periodic pumping, and while sailing through the edge of the cyclone in the Bay of Bengal, we were pumping around 7 tons of water a day, which was rather substantial. That being said, the vast majority of the time I was surprised again at how watertight, considering how many holes were in there. The primary way of keeping watertight was there were several layers to it. First of all was plugging all the holes with fiber plugs, and then basically putting a putty over each of those holes. And then after that, basically covering it with chunam, which is basically a sort of lime powder and animal fat, and put over in a layer, basically we call traditional anti-fouling. And all of that, I guess what you would call dramatically reduced the amount of water coming in. And combined also with making sure that the water, that the planks were basically soaking periodically with a fair amount of water. I felt sometimes we pumped her a little too dry, and then she would start to seep more. And then we left a little more water in her, and then she would basically dry up considerably. But it seemed to be it was something that you always had to keep an eye on, and we were always aware of. I'm actually incredibly impressed at how watertight the Gyptis is, and how it has been over several years. Much more so than many of the Western Indian Ocean vessels, sewn boats that we've seen.
And Patrice has told us about the coatings inside and out, the coatings on the lashings and the ligatures as well.
On the Mediterranean sewing, the stitching don't go outside, and they stay always inside the wood, the hull, but never outside. So that is also a good reason for the protection of the stitching.
Which brings up a question from Julia Bueto, which is the sewing of the Gyptis is quite sophisticated, with the stitching that doesn't go onto the outside. And in the Indian Ocean examples we've seen, we've either got double wadding or single wadding, but the stitches are definitely visible on the outside. Has that posed any problems for, well, I guess we've covered water tightness, but what about for wearing? Do they not get worn more easily?
I do know that that issue of wearing is slightly overcome by the fact that the stitches on the outside are recessed into the timbers normally, so they're not like standing proud of the timber, so they're not directly exposed.
But does the wadding itself provide some protection?
I would say no, actually. The Jewel of Muscat was double wadding, and one of the main concerns through the entire launch and voyage was actually protecting the wadding. And even once there was an inflatable rib that was moored next to it and rubbed off, I think, around 3 to 4 feet of the outer wadding that then had to be replaced. So the wadding was a sort of a constant concern. Yes, it was. I mean, on one hand, it's incredibly solid. It almost feels like a very soft wood. But if it's very what you would call susceptible to abrasion, so sort of constant rubbing back and forth very quickly deteriorates it, which is why in many ways the single wadding technique seems to be a much more efficient way of dealing with the sewn boats. But I mean, I was incredibly impressed with when Patrice and Pierre came to the workshop and basically showed us their way of sewing a boat. The rope workers from Kerala were also completely blown away. This was completely foreign to their way of stitching. In particular, the fact that the ropes were so thin and did not go outside, it completely transformed their conception of a sewn boat. But I think the success of the Gyptis has really proved, I guess, what you would call the ingenuity and I guess what you would call the success of that particular technique in the Mediterranean.
Eric, while I've got you, we've got Pat Tanner sent in a question about the Al Hariri replica, which is, what was the timber used on the Al Hariri replica? And now I'm going to say his sentence because I'm not sure I understand it. The planks appeared slightly cupped. Do you know if the planks were orientated, taking the hearth side into consideration, as the timber normally cups away from the hearth?
Actually, it was teak planking. Yeah, it was teak planking. And it wasn't quarter sawn. And what you will see on most plankings, if it sits in the sun long enough, you start to see that after some time. And so as opposed to, I mean, it's very interesting when European shipbuilders actually come to the Indian Ocean, one of the first things they comment is on basically the planking is not cut how they're used to, and it is rather different. But I hope that answers Pat's question.
Good. I've got a comment back from Tom Vosmer on flexibility. He says he's got an engineering student working on it, yes. So we can look forward to some results. Have we got time for one last question? Oh, I've got another one for Eric from Carlo Beltrami, who says he couldn't see any pegs in the holes for the sewing. So how did water not go through them? But was that just because the pictures were in earlier phase? Because they were pegged, weren't they, on the reconstructions?
Actually, for the Hariri boat, we did use pegs, but for the Jewel of Muscat, we used coconut fiber plugs, basically.
Yeah, and that worked.
And that worked
well enough.
Yes. Well enough. Let's put it
that
way.
Yes, Alessandro, the strakes on the Beyden Seyad, were they made from single planks without any scarves?
Yeah, yeah, there was single plank running from stern to stem, single plank, very wide, and so quite difficult to find thick planks that wide and with that length, especially with the width. But at the same time, since the boat doesn't have any frames, it actually makes sense not to put any scars or not having two planks on a strake, but just have a single plank for each strake. So something I should have put in the paper also. I just came into my mind right now.
Certainly from the drawings, you can see that they were single plank. I seem to remember. I suppose I wanted to point out that sewn boats are fascinating in themselves and fascinating from an ethnographic, iconographic point of view, but they have the possibility of taking us back into deep time archaeology before the use of metals, because obviously we're having increasingly evidence that people were voyaging, but we haven't found the boats yet, and we probably should be thinking about sewn planks for those very earliest sea voyaging vessels. Okay, so thank you all for tuning in. Thank you to all the attendees and to the panel. Many thanks to Lucy Blue, Eric Staples, Alessandra Guidoni, and Patrice Pâris. If you haven't read the articles that we've discussed today, they are available open access either through the Nautical Archaeology Society website or the Wiley IJNA website. Do go and check out the journal. Have a look at some of the past issues. You'll find other articles by all the members of our panel. And remember that there are excellent value subscriptions available with your Nautical Archaeology Society membership. Thanks to Mark Beattie Edwards and all the team in the Nautical Archaeology Society office, and of course to the Honor Frost Foundation for financial support for helping us take the journal to a wider audience. If you haven't seen the previous webinars, they're available on the Nautical Archaeology Society YouTube channel. Go and check them out. And look out for the next webinar, which I'm hoping we can squeeze another one in before Christmas. Thank you very much.